The morning mist clung to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado like a shroud, carrying whispers of salt air and anticipation across the graduation ceremony grounds. In just 3 hours, Bud's Class 247 would cross the stage, the few who had survived Hell Week, the brutal months of selection, and every test designed to break ordinary men into extraordinary warriors. Among the proud families gathering behind rope barriers, one woman sat alone on a weathered bench, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She didn't belong here, not in the way that mattered to the wives clustering together with their shared stories of deployment separations and base life, not among the fathers comparing their own military service or the mothers who had spent years learning the language of this world, the acronyms, the ranks, the unspoken hierarchies. She was just Sarah Chen, a software engineer from Sacramento who had driven 5 hours to watch her daughter Emily become a Navy SEAL. But something about her stillness drew attention she didn't seek, the way her eyes tracked movement across the ceremony grounds with calculated precision, the manner in which she positioned herself with perfect sight lines to both the stage and the parking area behind her. How her breathing remained controlled and measured while other parents fidgeted with nervous energy. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy blazer, comfortable flats, nothing that should have marked her as different, yet several base personnel had glanced her way twice, as if trying to solve a puzzle they couldn't quite identify. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Sarah Chen had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since Emily called to tell her she had made it through the final phase of SEAL training. The pride in her daughter's voice had been unmistakable, tinged with exhaustion and an edge of something harder, the knowledge that she had survived something most people couldn't imagine. But beneath Sarah's maternal pride ran an undercurrent she couldn't share with anyone. Watching her daughter earn the trident would mean confronting ghosts she had buried 20 years ago in classified files and sealed records. She checked her watch. 0847 hours. The ceremony would begin at 1000. Around her, the crowd continued to build. Families claimed spots along the viewing area, spreading blankets and adjusting folding chairs. Children ran between the adults, their excited voices mixing with the distant sound of waves against the base perimeter. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the pristine order of the naval facility. White buildings gleaming against blue sky. Flags snapping in the ocean breeze, everything aligned with military precision. Sarah's gaze drifted to the platform where the graduation would take place. A simple stage, really, but it represented the culmination of a journey that claimed 90% of those who attempted it. Her daughter had started buddits with 47 other candidates. Today, only 12 would receive their tridents. Emily Chen would be the only woman among them. A fact that had already drawn media attention and considerable scrutiny from both supporters and skeptics within the SEAL community. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. 23 years ago, she had been the only woman in her own elite unit, though the world would never know it. Her service record had been sanitized, her achievements buried beneath layers of classification that protected national secrets and the fragile egos of those who preferred their heroes to fit traditional molds. She had made peace with that silence long ago. But sitting here now, watching preparations for her daughter's moment of recognition, she felt the weight of hidden history pressing against her chest like a held breath. A young petty officer approached the family viewing area, clipboard in hand, checking credentials and directing traffic. When he reached Sarah's bench, his polite smile faltered slightly. She handed him her visitor's pass without being asked, the document identifying her simply as S. Chen, family member. He scanned it, then glanced at her again with the same puzzled expression she'd seen from others that morning. "First time at a Bud-S graduation?" he asked, clearly trying to place her. "Yes," she replied simply. "My daughter's graduating today." The petty officer's eyebrows rose. There was only one female candidate in Class 247, which meant this quiet woman was Emily Chen's mother. He studied her with renewed interest, as if trying to reconcile the soft-spoken civilian before him with the warrior daughter who had just conquered one of the military's most demanding programs. "That's incredible, ma'am. Your daughter is..." She's making history today. Sarah nodded, accepting his comment with the same calm grace she had shown throughout Emily's childhood whenever teachers or coaches remarked on her daughter's exceptional abilities. She had always been proud of Emily, but she had also been careful never to reveal where those abilities might have originated. Some gifts were better left unexplained. As the petty officer moved on, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. If only he knew that making history was something of a family tradition, even if most of that history would never see the light of day. The crowd continued to grow, but Sarah remained an island of stillness in the rising excitement. She watched the careful choreography of the ceremony setup, noting details others missed: the positioning of security personnel, the sightlines from surrounding buildings, the quiet efficiency of the support staff. Old habits, perhaps, but ones that had kept her alive in places where observation was the difference between mission success and catastrophe. At Edo 23, a black sedan pulled into the Itaho VIP parking area near the stage. Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly as she recognized the bearing of the man who emerged, tall, silver-haired, moving with the controlled authority of someone accustomed to command. She couldn't see his face clearly from this distance, but something about his silhouette triggered a memory she had spent years trying to forget. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her expression unchanged, but inside, her heartbeat quickened. She told herself it was impossible. Too much time had passed. Too many classified operations had been completed and buried. Too many people had moved on to new assignments and new lives. But as the figure approached the ceremony platform, Sarah Chen felt the careful distance she had maintained between her past and present beginning to narrow. In less than 40 minutes, her daughter would receive her seal trident, and Sarah was beginning to suspect that this ceremony would reveal far more than Emily's achievement. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last wisps of coastal fog, and with it, the protective mist that had hidden truths too long buried in shadow. The first wave of dismissal came disguised as concern. Sarah was reviewing the ceremony program when a woman in her 50s approached, wearing a base spouse club t-shirt and the confident smile of someone accustomed to organizing other people's experiences. "Honey, are you sure you're in the right section?" the woman asked, glancing at Sarah's simple civilian attire and then at the family viewing area. "The general public seating is over there by the fence. This area is reserved for immediate family only." Sarah looked up calmly, folding the program with precise edges. "My daughter is graduating today, Emily Chen." The woman's expression shifted through several phases: surprise, skepticism, then something approaching concern masked as helpfulness. "Oh, well, that's wonderful. But you know, dear, you might want to prepare yourself. The media attention around your daughter has been quite intense. Some people have very strong opinions about women in the SEALs." "I'm aware," Sarah replied simply. "It's just that this is such a traditional ceremony. These men have earned something very special, and their families have sacrificed alongside them. You might find the atmosphere a bit overwhelming if you're not familiar with military culture." The condescension was delivered with such practiced sweetness that it took Sarah a moment to process the full insult. This woman assumed that because Sarah appeared to be an uninitiated civilian, she couldn't possibly understand the weight of what was happening here. Worse, there was an underlying suggestion that Emily's presence somehow diminished the achievement of the male candidates. Before Sarah could respond, 2 more spouse club members materialized, drawn by their leader's voice. They flanked Sarah's bench like a well-meaning intervention committee. "Mrs. Chen." One asked, consulting a phone screen. "I looked you up online. You're a software engineer, right? From Sacramento?" Sarah nodded, recognizing the subtle interrogation disguised as friendly interest. "That's nice," the woman continued. "It must be so hard to understand what Emily has been through, coming from such a different world. These boys," she gestured toward the staging area where some of the graduating SEALs were visible, "they've been through literal hell together. Their families have been living this journey for years." The third woman chimed in with practiced sympathy. "Has Emily explained the brotherhood to you? The SEAL teams are like a family within a family. It's very exclusive, very traditional. I just hope she's prepared for what comes next." Sarah felt the careful architecture of assumptions being built around her. In their minds, she was the clueless civilian mother who had somehow produced a daughter tough enough to survive SEAL training, but who herself remained completely outside the warrior culture that defined this community. They saw someone who needed education, guidance, perhaps even protection from the harsh realities of military life. "The sacrifice is incredible," the first woman continued, settling uninvited onto Sarah's bench. "My husband is a chief petty officer. 22 years of deployments, dangerous missions, operations I'm not even allowed to know about. That's the life your daughter is choosing. I just hope you've prepared yourself for the worry, the sleepless nights, the months of not knowing where she is or if she's safe." Sarah's hands remained folded, her expression unchanged. "I understand the nature of the commitment." "Do you?" The question came with a patronizing tilt of the head. "Because this isn't like other military jobs. SEALs go places and do things that, well, let's just say the casualty rates speak for themselves. And with Emily being the first woman," the sentence hung unfinished, heavy with implication. Around them, other family members had begun to notice the conversation. Some glanced over with curiosity, others with the studied indifference of people trying not to eavesdrop. Sarah was aware that she was being evaluated, categorized, found wanting by standards she wasn't expected to meet. A man in his 60s approached their group, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap and the confident bearing of someone whose opinions carried weight in this community. "Ladies," he nodded to the spouse club members, then fixed Sarah with a measuring look. "You must be Emily's mother. Hell of a thing what that girl accomplished." Sarah inclined her head politely. "Thank you." "Takes real guts," he continued. "Course it's different for women. They had to modify some of the standards, didn't they? Make accommodations?" His tone was carefully neutral, but the question hung like a challenge. "No," Sarah replied quietly. "The standards weren't modified." The veteran's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well, that's not what I heard. But either way, it's impressive. Takes a special kind of family to produce that kind of determination. Military background, I assume? Your husband served?" "No military background," Sarah said, offering no elaboration. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken judgments. How could a civilian family, with no understanding of military culture, have produced someone capable of surviving the most demanding training in the armed forces? The veteran studied Sarah with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. "Huh," he said finally. "That's unusual. Most of these kids, especially the ones who make it through, they come from military families, understand the mindset from childhood, know what they're getting into." He paused, clearly fishing for more information. "What's your background, Mrs. Chen?" "Software engineering," she repeated, the same answer she had given a dozen times that morning. Right. Computers." He said it like she had claimed to be a professional butterfly collector. "Well, that's different. Good for you supporting Emily's choice, even if you can't really understand what it means." The dismissal was complete now, delivered with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned his right to define belonging and understanding within this community. Sarah was not just an outsider, she was an anomaly, a glitch in the natural order where warriors came from warrior families and understood each other through shared sacrifice. As the veteran moved away, the spouse club women exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Their mission was clear: educate the naive civilian mother about the reality she had stumbled into. "Mrs. Chen," the leader said gently, "I don't want you to feel unwelcome. We're just trying to help you understand what you're seeing today. This ceremony isn't just about individual achievement. It's about joining something ancient and sacred. These men have earned the right to call each other brother. They've suffered together, bled together, saved each other's lives." She paused, choosing her words carefully. Emily is obviously exceptional, but she's entering a world that has been exclusively male for 60 years. There are bound to be challenges, adjustments, and as her mother, you'll need to be prepared for that reality. Sarah nodded once, accepting the lecture with the same quiet composure she had shown throughout the interaction. Inside, she was calculating the distance to each exit, noting the positions of security personnel, and remembering other times when she had been underestimated by people who confused ignorance with weakness. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so profound. These well-meaning people were explaining military culture and warrior brotherhood to someone who had lived it at levels they couldn't imagine, in places that didn't appear on any public map, carrying responsibilities that would never be acknowledged in any ceremony. But Sarah Chen had learned long ago that the most effective camouflage was often the truth, told partially and without context. She was exactly what she claimed to be, a software engineer from Sacramento who had come to watch her daughter graduate. The fact that she had once been other things in other places, under other names, was information these people had no need to possess. As the ceremony start time approached and the crowd's attention shifted toward the staging area, Sarah remained on her bench, surrounded by people who had decided they understood exactly who she was and what she represented. None of them noticed the way her eyes continued to track movement patterns across the base or how her breathing remained controlled despite the emotional weight of their assumptions. They saw a civilian who didn't belong. What they missed was a warrior who had spent decades perfecting the art of belonging nowhere and everywhere, depending on what the mission required. The transformation began with something as simple as a dropped program. A gust of ocean wind caught the ceremony schedule from a family near Sarah's bench, sending it skittering across the ground toward a maintenance area marked with security barriers. The paper was nothing important, just a timeline of events. But the young Marine Lance Corporal, who had been tasked with crowd control, started after it anyway, stepping around the rope barrier with the dutiful determination of someone who took every detail seriously. Sarah watched him approach the restricted zone and spoke quietly. "Lance Corporal." He paused, looking back at her with surprise. Most civilians didn't address Marines by rank, and certainly not with the crisp precision she had used. "The wind pattern here runs northeast to southwest," she continued, nodding toward a cluster of flags in the distance. "Your paper will settle against the building foundation in about 30 seconds. No need to cross into the maintenance area." The Marine followed her gaze, noting the flags she had referenced, calculating the wind direction with the automatic competence of someone trained in environmental awareness. Sure enough, the paper drifted exactly where she had predicted, coming to rest against a concrete barrier well outside the restricted zone. He retrieved it with a few quick steps, then returned to where Sarah sat, studying her with new curiosity. "Thank you, ma'am. That was very precise." Sarah accepted the comment with a slight nod, as if accurately reading wind patterns at unfamiliar installations was something any reasonable person could do. The Marine lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to ask how a civilian software engineer had developed such situational awareness, but his training and appropriate boundaries won out. He moved on, though he glanced back twice. The Spouse Club leader had witnessed the exchange and seized on it as confirmation of her earlier assessment. "See?" she said to her companions. "Engineering mind. Very detail-oriented. That's probably how Emily developed her focus, growing up with a mother who notices everything." Her explanation was logical, reasonable, and completely missed the point. Sarah's observation hadn't come from engineering precision, but from years of reading environmental factors in places where wind direction could mean the difference between concealment and exposure, between mission success and catastrophic failure. But there was no need to correct the misunderstanding. 20 minutes later, as families began arranging themselves for optimal viewing positions, a commotion arose near the VIP seating area. An older gentleman in a Navy dress uniform was having difficulty with what appeared to be a malfunctioning hearing aid. He tapped the device repeatedly, growing increasingly frustrated as electronic squealing echoed from the small speaker. "Damn thing picked a hell of a time to act up," he muttered to his wife, loud enough for nearby families to hear. Sarah glanced toward the sound, her trained ear immediately identifying the problem. She had encountered similar issues countless times in field communications, where equipment failure could compromise entire operations. After a moment's hesitation, she approached the uniformed gentleman. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly. "I think your hearing aid frequency might be conflicting with the ceremony's wireless microphone system. They're probably running a sound check on the same band." The man looked at her skeptically. "You know about hearing aids?" "I know about radio frequency interference," Sarah replied simply. If you adjust your device to bypass the 2.4 gigahertz range, it should clear up once they finish testing the wireless mics. She provided the specific adjustment sequence, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had troubleshot communications equipment under far more challenging circumstances. The man followed her instructions, and the squealing immediately stopped. "I'll be damned," he said, studying her with renewed interest. "Where'd you learn about RF interference?" "You pick things up," Sarah said, already stepping back toward her bench, but the uniformed gentleman wasn't finished. "Ma'am, I've been dealing with military communications for 30 years, and most civilians wouldn't know a frequency band from a rubber band." That was some pretty specific technical knowledge. Sarah offered a polite smile that acknowledged his comment without expanding on it. "I hope you enjoy the ceremony, sir." As she walked away, she heard him telling his wife, "Strangest thing, that woman knew more about radio systems than half my communications technicians." The Spouse Club women had observed this interaction as well, and their leader approached Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and renewed condescension. "My goodness, you do know about everything, don't you? Engineering really does give you such a broad knowledge base." "Some problems have universal solutions," Sarah replied, settling back onto her bench. But the woman wasn't satisfied with such a simple explanation. "Still, it's impressive. Emily certainly didn't get her technical aptitude from nowhere, though I have to say, it's fascinating how different your approach is from military families. We're so used to learning about equipment because our husbands bring that world home with them. You've had to develop that knowledge independently." Once again, the assumption was logical and completely wrong. Sarah's familiarity with communications equipment hadn't been developed independently. It had been earned through countless hours of training with specialists who demanded perfection, because lives depended on flawless execution. But correcting the misconception would require explanations she had no intention of providing. The third hint came during the final setup phase, as ceremony personnel conducted last-minute security checks. A young ensign with a clipboard was reviewing sightlines from surrounding buildings, clearly following a checklist designed to identify potential security vulnerabilities. Sarah watched him work, noting his methodical approach and the way he consulted what appeared to be a threat assessment protocol. When he reached the area near her bench, she noticed him struggling with an angular calculation that would determine whether a particular roofline offered concealment for someone with hostile intent. He held his hands up in a frame, trying to estimate elevation and distance, but his mathematics were clearly rusty. 37 degrees, Sarah said quietly. The ensign looked at her, confused. "Ma'am? The elevation angle from that roofline to the ceremony platform. You're trying to calculate line of sight, but you're estimating too low. It's 37 degrees, which puts it well within effective range for most standard equipment." The young officer stared at her, then back at his calculation sheet, then at the roofline in question. He pulled out a small angle measuring device and took a reading. When he checked his instrument, his expression shifted to amazement. 37.2 degrees, he said slowly. "How did you—" "The building height relative to the platform distance creates a predictable triangle," Sarah explained matter-of-factly. "Basic trigonometry." It wasn't basic trigonometry, and they both knew it. The calculation required an experienced eye for distance estimation, an understanding of elevation mathematics, and the kind of automatic threat assessment that came from extensive training in security protocols. But Sarah's explanation was delivered with such casual confidence that the ensign found himself nodding as if civilian software engineers routinely performed complex angular calculations for security assessments. "Right," he said uncertainly. "Basic trigonometry, of course." He made a note on his clipboard, marked the roofline as a potential concern, and moved on. But Sarah caught him, glancing back at her repeatedly, clearly trying to reconcile her civilian appearance with the precision of her observation. By now, a small circle of awareness had formed around Sarah Chen. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just a growing sense among the people who had interacted with her that there were layers beneath her quiet civilian exterior that didn't quite match their assumptions. The Marine Lance Corporal found excuses to patrol near her section. The Navy gentleman with the hearing aid pointed her out to colleagues as that woman who knows about RF systems. The ensign completed his security check but kept her location in his peripheral awareness. Sarah remained exactly where she had been all morning, a civilian mother waiting to watch her daughter graduate. But the careful camouflage of ordinariness was beginning to show small cracks, revealing glimpses of knowledge and capability that belonged to a different world entirely. The Spouse Club women, still convinced they understood exactly who she was, continued their well-meaning education about military culture. They explained traditions she had lived, sacrifices she had made, and challenges she had survived in contexts they couldn't imagine. Their kindness was genuine, their assumptions reasonable, and their blindness to the truth complete. As the ceremony start time approached and the crowd settled into final positions, Sarah Chen sat quietly on her weathered bench, surrounded by people who thought they had her figured out. None of them realized they were in the presence of someone whose own service record, if it could ever be declassified, would humble every story they had shared about sacrifice and brotherhood. The first hints were in place now, small fractures in the facade of civilian ignorance. Soon, much larger revelations would follow, and the careful distance Sarah had maintained between her past and present would collapse entirely. But for now, she was still just a software engineer from Sacramento, waiting to watch her daughter become a Navy SEAL. The fact that she had once been one of the most classified operatives in United States military history remained safely buried beneath layers of security clearances and sealed records, at least for the next 37 minutes. The silence that followed Commander Harrison's words stretched across the ceremony grounds like a held breath. Every person within earshot, family members, base personnel, even the media representatives at the perimeter, stood frozen in the crystalline moment when everything they thought they knew had just been shattered and rebuilt. Sarah Chen remained exactly where she had been for the past 3 hours, seated on her weathered bench, hands folded quietly in her lap, wearing the same simple civilian clothes that had marked her as an outsider since the morning began. But the space around her had transformed completely. The dismissive glances were gone, replaced by stares of stunned recognition. The condescending explanations about military culture had evaporated into embarrassed silence. The careful boundaries that had separated the initiated from the civilian observer had dissolved entirely. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, a 28-year SEAL veteran who had been standing near the VIP section, was the first to move. He had served 3 tours with Operational Detachment Alpha units, had worked alongside some of the most classified personnel in the Special Operations community, and he had heard whispers about Phantom Team throughout his career, legends told in secure briefing rooms about operatives so deep black that their existence was known only to a handful of people at the highest levels of command. Rodriguez stepped forward slowly, his weathered face carrying the weight of sudden understanding. He had been one of the Spouse Club women's husbands, earlier dismissed as just another family member, someone who couldn't possibly comprehend the sacrifice and brotherhood of elite military service. Now, he realized he had been standing in the presence of someone whose service record made his own distinguished career look like basic training. He stopped 3 feet from Sarah's bench, came to full attention, and raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ceremony grounds. "Master Chief Rodriguez, SEAL Team 5. It is an absolute honor." The salute was held with perfect precision, not the casual acknowledgement of rank that marked most military interactions, but the profound gesture of respect offered to someone whose sacrifices had protected people who would never even know her name. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture rigid with the kind of military bearing reserved for the most solemn occasions. Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the gesture she believed belonged to others, not to her anymore. 20 years of carefully maintained civilian identity had created distance from the protocols and ceremonies of her former life. She had spent so long hiding in plain sight that being seen, truly seen, felt like standing naked under a spotlight. But Rodriguez held his salute unwavering, and slowly, with the muscle memory that never truly fades, Sarah rose from her bench and returned the honor with quiet precision. Her hand moved to the correct position automatically, her posture straightened into the bearing she had carried through countless classified missions, and for just a moment, the software engineer from Sacramento disappeared entirely. When she lowered her hand, Rodriguez maintained his salute for another heartbeat before dropping his arm to his side. The gesture was noticed immediately by every service member within sight. Chief Petty Officer Williams, who had been supervising security near the staging area, saw his Master Chief saluting a civilian family member and moved closer to investigate. When he recognized the significance of what was happening, Master Chief Rodriguez didn't salute anyone except under the most extraordinary circumstances. Williams came to attention and added his own salute to the tribute. "Chief Williams, DevGru support," he announced formally. "Ma'am, the honor is ours." The effect rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. Petty Officer Martinez, who had been directing family seating arrangements, saw two senior enlisted men saluting the woman he had dismissed as an uninformed civilian earlier that morning. He didn't understand what was happening, but he understood the chain of respect that governed military culture. If Master Chief Rodriguez was saluting, there was a reason that demanded his own acknowledgement. Martinez snapped to attention and raised his hand, adding his voice to the growing chorus. "Petty Officer Martinez, ma'am, thank you for your service." Within moments, what had begun as one man's recognition of extraordinary service had become a wave of salutes spreading across the ceremony grounds. Sailors who had been setting up chairs stopped their work and came to attention. Marines providing security added their acknowledgement to the growing tribute. Even Air Force personnel who had arrived to support the joint ceremony joined the spontaneous demonstration of respect. The sound was remarkable. Dozens of boots snapping together in unison, the rustle of dress uniforms as hands moved to salute position, the collective intake of breath as more service members realized what was happening and added their voices to the formal acknowledgement. "Seaman Davis, thank you, ma'am. Corporal Henderson, United States Marine Corps, the honor is mine. Petty Officer Chen, no relation, USS Roosevelt, ma'am, thank you for keeping us safe." Each salute was held with perfect military precision, but underneath the formal protocol was something much deeper. The recognition of someone who had served in ways they couldn't imagine, in places they had never heard of, carrying responsibilities that would never appear in any public ceremony or official record. The families who had been so quick to educate Sarah about military culture now stood speechless, watching their husbands and sons salute a woman they had dismissed as an uninitiated civilian. The spouse club leader, who had explained sacrifice and brotherhood to someone who had lived both in their purest forms, stood with her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the magnitude of her misunderstanding. Commander Harrison, who had started this revelation by speaking Sarah's call sign, watched the spreading tribute with profound emotion. He had known this moment would come eventually. Phantom Team service deserved recognition, even if it could never be fully public. But seeing the spontaneous acknowledgement from service members who understood, without needing details, that they were in the presence of someone exceptional, moved him more than he had expected. The media representatives at the ceremony perimeter were filming frantically, though they had no context for what they were documenting. All they could capture was the image of dozens of military personnel saluting a civilian woman who sat quietly accepting their tribute with the humble dignity of someone who had never sought recognition for her service. But it was the graduating SEAL candidates themselves who provided the most powerful moment of acknowledgement. Emily Chen, still in formation with her 11 classmates, had watched in stunned amazement as her quiet civilian mother became the center of the most extraordinary military tribute she had ever witnessed. When Master Chief Rodriguez's salute had begun the cascade of recognition, Emily had felt the final pieces of a lifetime puzzle clicking into place. The unexplained knowledge her mother had always possessed, the way Sarah had understood military culture without ever claiming any connection to it. The calm competence she had shown in crisis situations throughout Emily's childhood, the careful way she had answered questions about her background, always truthful but never complete. Now, still in formation, but with tears streaming down her face, Emily Chen raised her hand in salute to her own mother, adding her voice to the tribute with words that carried the weight of 23 years of questions finally answered. "Seaman Recruit Chen, United States Navy, ma'am. Thank you for showing me what service really means." The 12 graduating SEALs followed their classmates' lead, turning toward Sarah in perfect unison and adding their salutes to the overwhelming demonstration of respect. These were men who had just completed the most demanding training in the military, who would soon carry the trident and all the responsibility it represented. Their acknowledgement of Sarah's service carried special weight, the recognition of one generation of warriors honoring another. Sarah remained standing throughout the entire tribute, accepting each salute with the quiet dignity that had defined her service. She didn't bask in the recognition, didn't allow pride to show on her face, didn't use the moment to claim any spotlight. She simply stood as she always had, steady, humble, focused on something larger than herself. When the last salute had been offered and the ceremony grounds had settled back into relative quiet, Sarah Chen slowly took her seat on the weathered bench. The transformation was remarkable. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning, wearing the same civilian clothes and maintaining the same calm composure. But everything around her had changed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. The families who had questioned her belonging now watched her with awe. The service members who had dismissed her as an uninformed civilian now understood they had been in the presence of someone whose service surpassed their own. The spouse club women who had tried to educate her about sacrifice and brotherhood now realized they had been explaining concepts to someone who had lived them at their deepest levels. But perhaps most importantly, Emily Chen now understood that the quiet strength she had always admired in her mother came from a place of service so profound it could never be fully acknowledged, from sacrifices so complete they had required the surrender of recognition itself. The ceremony was about to resume, but nothing would ever be the same. Sarah Chen was no longer the civilian outsider who needed education about military culture. She was exactly what she had always been, a warrior whose service had protected people who would never know her name, whose sacrifices had made possible the freedom others enjoyed, whose dedication to duty had required the ultimate gift of anonymity. The salutes had ended, but the recognition would last forever. In the wake of the spontaneous tribute, a profound stillness settled over the ceremony grounds. The dozens of salutes had ended, but their echoes seemed to hang in the salt air like a benediction. Service members returned to their duties with quiet reverence. Families whispered among themselves in hushed tones, and the media representatives struggled to contextualize what they had just witnessed for their audiences. But amidst all this activity, one figure remained frozen in place, paralyzed by the crushing weight of realization. The Vietnam veteran who had questioned Sarah's background stood exactly where the tribute had found him, his weathered hands still at his sides, his face pale with the kind of shock that comes when everything you thought you knew about the world proves to be wrong. For the past 3 hours, he had been the voice of institutional authority, the keeper of standards who determined who belonged in the military community and who remained forever outside it. He had looked at Sarah Chen and seen exactly what he expected to see, a civilian who had stumbled into a world she couldn't comprehend, a software engineer whose daughter had somehow achieved something that should have been impossible without proper military heritage. He had dismissed her politely but completely, secure in his understanding of how warriors were made and where they came from. Now he stood facing the wreckage of those assumptions, understanding that he had spent the morning explaining military culture to someone whose service record made his own distinguished career look like a weekend camping trip. The woman he had patronized with lectures about sacrifice and brotherhood had lived both concepts at levels he couldn't imagine, in places that didn't appear on any public map, carrying responsibilities that would never be acknowledged in any ceremony. His name was Colonel, retired, James McCready, though most people at the base simply called him Colonel Mac. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter pilot, earning a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 Purple Hearts before transitioning to a successful civilian career in defense contracting. For 40 years, his military service had been the defining achievement of his life, the foundation of his identity, and the source of his authority within veteran communities. He was accustomed to respect, deference, and the automatic credibility that came with his combat record. When he spoke about military matters, people listened. When he evaluated someone's claim to understand warrior culture, his opinion carried weight. He had been the measuring stick by which others were judged, the living embodiment of earned your place mentality that governed military hierarchies. But standing there in the aftermath of Sarah's recognition, McCready felt something he hadn't experienced since his rookie days as a young lieutenant, the humbling realization that he didn't know everything, that his perspective was limited, that there were levels of service beyond his understanding. The spouse club leader, who had orchestrated so much of the morning's condescension toward Sarah, approached him tentatively. Her own face was streaked with tears of embarrassment and regret, but she seemed to need confirmation of what they had all witnessed. "Colonel Mack," she said quietly. "Did you know? Did you have any idea who she was?" McCready shook his head slowly, his voice hoarse when he finally found it. "No, I didn't know." He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate. "I served 2 tours in Vietnam, 36 missions. I thought I understood what service looked like, what sacrifice meant. I thought I could spot a warrior from across a room." He gestured toward Sarah, who remained seated on her bench with the same quiet composure she had maintained all morning. "That woman served in ways I can't even imagine. While I was flying helicopters, following orders, doing my job within established parameters, she was... God knows what she was doing. Operations so classified they don't exist. Responsibilities so heavy they required her to surrender every form of recognition." The spouse club leader followed his gaze, seeing Sarah with completely different eyes. "We spent the morning explaining military culture to her." "No," McCready corrected gently. "We spent the morning explaining our understanding of military culture to someone who lived it at its deepest level. We were children showing pictures to an artist, civilians lecturing a general about what service means." The weight of his realization settled over him like a physical burden. Every patronizing comment, every assumption about her ignorance, every moment of dismissed authority came flooding back with crystal clarity. He remembered the way he had questioned her daughter's achievements, suggesting that standards must have been lowered or accommodations made. He remembered the casual way he had dismissed her claim to understand the nature of SEAL commitment. Most painfully, he remembered the confident authority with which he had explained that warriors came from warrior families, that understanding military culture required growing up in it, that civilians like Sarah could never truly comprehend what their children were choosing. He had been so completely, catastrophically wrong that the error felt like a betrayal of everything he claimed to represent. "I need to," McCready started, then stopped, uncertain what words could possibly address the magnitude of his mistake. An apology seemed insufficient, almost insulting in its inadequacy. How do you apologize for 40 years of misunderstanding about the nature of service? How do you acknowledge that your entire framework for understanding sacrifice was incomplete? He walked slowly toward Sarah's bench, each step feeling heavier than the last. Around him, the ceremony preparations continued, but his world had narrowed to this single moment of reckoning. Other families watched his approach with curiosity, sensing the significance without understanding its source. When he reached Sarah, she looked up with the same calm attention she had shown throughout their earlier interaction. There was no anger in her expression, no judgment, no expectation of groveling or dramatic apology. She simply waited with the patient dignity of someone who had spent decades being misunderstood and had made peace with the necessity of anonymity. McCready stood there for a long moment, struggling with words that felt too small for what needed to be said. Finally, he spoke with the simple honesty of a man confronting the limitations of his own understanding. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. This morning I questioned your daughter's achievements, suggested that standards had been lowered, implied that your family couldn't understand military culture because you lacked proper background." Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without encouraging or discouraging their continuation. "I was wrong," McCready continued, "not just mistaken, but profoundly, completely wrong in ways that embarrass everything I claim to represent. You've served in ways I can't comprehend, sacrificed in ways that humble my own experience, and carried responsibilities that make my combat record look like basic training." He paused, working to steady his voice. I spent the morning lecturing you about sacrifice and brotherhood, explaining concepts to someone who lived them at their purest levels. I was so confident in my understanding, so certain about who belonged and who didn't, that I couldn't see the truth standing right in front of me. Sarah listened without changing expression, her hands still folded quietly in her lap. When he finished, she was silent for a moment before responding with characteristic simplicity. "Colonel Macready," she said, "you served your country with honor. You flew dangerous missions, saved lives, carried out your duties with distinction. That service has value regardless of what anyone else has done. There's no hierarchy of sacrifice that diminishes what you gave." Her words were delivered without condescension, without the patronizing tone he had used with her earlier. She spoke to him as one veteran to another, acknowledging his service while gently correcting his understanding about how that service should be measured. "But," she continued quietly, "military culture is broader and deeper than any single perspective can capture. There are levels of service, types of sacrifice, forms of duty that exist in shadows and silence, not better or worse than public service, just different, hidden for reasons that have nothing to do with shame and everything to do with necessity." Macready nodded, finally beginning to understand the scope of his misperception. Military culture wasn't the exclusive domain of people like him, traditional warriors with public records and acknowledged achievements. It included Sarah's world of classified operations and unnamed heroes, Emily's generation of barrier-breaking pioneers, and countless others whose service took forms he had never considered. "Your daughter," he said, struggling to find appropriate words. "She comes from warrior heritage, after all, just not the kind I recognized." Sarah's expression softened slightly, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that he was beginning to understand. "Emily comes from a family that believes service is about duty, not recognition. She learned that watching her father work as a high school teacher, her grandfather volunteer at the VA hospital, her mother do whatever needed to be done. Warriors aren't made only in military families, Colonel. They're made wherever people learn to put something larger than themselves first." The conversation was interrupted by the ceremony announcer calling for final positions. The Bud-S graduation was about to begin, and families needed to take their seats for the formal presentation. Macready knew he needed to return to his own section, but he couldn't leave without completing what he had started. Slowly, deliberately, he came to full attention and raised his hand in a crisp salute, not the casual acknowledgement he had offered other veterans throughout the morning, but the formal gesture of profound respect reserved for those whose service transcended ordinary understanding. "Ma'am," he said with quiet dignity, "Colonel Macready, United States Army, retired. It has been the honor of my lifetime to meet you, and I will spend the rest of my days remembering this lesson in humility you've given me." Sarah rose from her bench and returned his salute with the same precision she had shown to Master Chief Rodriguez, acknowledging not just his gesture, but the growth it represented. When they both lowered their hands, Macready felt something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of service, sacrifice, and the many forms that both could take. As he walked back toward his family section, Macready carried with him a new perspective that would influence every future interaction with veterans, every conversation about military culture, every assumption about who belonged and who didn't. The confident authority with which he had dismissed Sarah that morning was gone, replaced by hard-earned humility and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of service. Behind him, Sarah Chen resumed her seat on the weathered bench, preparing to watch her daughter receive the recognition that 20 years of classified service had denied her. The morning's antagonist had been transformed not through confrontation or dramatic revelation, but through the quiet power of truth revealed and acknowledged. The ceremony was about to begin, and everything had changed. The graduation ceremony proceeded with military precision, but the undercurrent of awareness about Sarah Chen's presence transformed every moment. Commander Harrison delivered his opening remarks with renewed gravity, speaking about sacrifice and service with the knowledge that someone in the audience embodied those concepts at their highest levels. The families listened with deeper attention, many stealing glances at the quiet woman on the weathered bench who had redefined their understanding of what service could mean. When Emily Chen's name was called to receive her seal trident, The applause was thunderous, not just the proud celebration typical of such moments, but something more profound. Everyone present understood they were witnessing history. The first woman to complete SEAL training was receiving her recognition in the presence of her mother, whose own service had blazed trails in darkness that would never be fully illuminated. Emily walked across the stage with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through months of brutal training. But when she reached Commander Harrison to receive her trident, her eyes found her mother in the crowd. The look they exchanged contained 23 years of questions finally answered, pride finally understood, and a legacy of service that connected 2 generations of warriors who had chosen duty over recognition. As the ceremony concluded and families began their celebrations, the transformation around Sarah became even more apparent. The Spouse Club women, who had spent the morning educating her about military culture, now approached with profound embarrassment and genuine respect. Their leader, tears still fresh on her cheeks, offered an apology that Sarah accepted with characteristic grace, pointing out that their desire to help had come from good intentions, even if their assumptions had been wrong. "You were protecting something you valued," Sarah told her gently. "That instinct to preserve and explain military culture comes from love of community. The fact that you didn't recognize one form of service doesn't diminish your dedication to honoring all service." The woman nodded gratefully, understanding that she was receiving forgiveness she hadn't expected, and grace she certainly hadn't earned. Around them, other family members waited for their own opportunities to acknowledge what they had witnessed, to apologize for assumptions, to express gratitude for service they could never fully understand. But the most significant transformation was taking place among the graduating SEALs themselves. Emily's classmates had watched their teammate's mother receive recognition from some of the most senior enlisted personnel on the base, had witnessed a spontaneous tribute that spoke to service at the highest levels, had seen their own understanding of warrior heritage challenged and expanded. During the reception that followed, these newest members of the SEAL community sought out Emily with new respect, not just for her achievement in completing their shared ordeal, but for the legacy she carried and the example her family represented. They had entered training believing that warriors came from traditional military backgrounds, that understanding service required growing up in its culture, that excellence was inherited through established bloodlines. Sarah Chen's story, what little they could piece together from the morning's revelation, shattered those assumptions completely. Here was proof that the highest levels of service could emerge from shadows they had never considered, that sacrifice could take forms they had never imagined, that the warrior ethos could be passed down through silence and humility rather than stories and ceremonies. Master Chief Rodriguez, who had offered the first salute in the spontaneous tribute, approached Emily during the reception with advice that would shape her understanding of the responsibility she was inheriting. "Your mother's generation served in ways that required them to surrender recognition," he told her quietly. "They carried out missions that protected people who would never know their names, made sacrifices that could never be publicly acknowledged, lived with the weight of classified responsibilities that would have broken most people." He paused, studying Emily with the measuring gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating character and potential. "Your generation has different opportunities. You can serve openly, achieve recognition, inspire others through your example. That's progress, but it's also responsibility. You carry forward not just your own achievements, but the legacy of those who served in silence before you." Emily listened with the focused attention of someone who understood she was receiving wisdom that would guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The weight of her mother's hidden service, combined with her own visible achievement, created a unique burden and opportunity that she was only beginning to comprehend. As the afternoon progressed, word of the morning's events spread throughout the base community. Personnel who hadn't witnessed the tribute directly heard about it from those who had, and the story grew in the telling, not through exaggeration, but through the addition of context that made its significance even more profound. Senior officers who understood the classification levels involved began to piece together the magnitude of what had been revealed. While they couldn't discuss specifics, their quiet conversations with trusted colleagues conveyed the gravity of having someone with Sarah's background present at such a public ceremony. The base chaplain, Father Martinez, sought out Sarah during the reception to express his gratitude for what her service had meant to the countless people whose safety had depended on operations she had conducted. He spoke about the spiritual significance of service that required such complete selflessness, the profound faith it took to carry out duties that could never be acknowledged or celebrated. "Your sacrifice was complete," he told her with quiet reverence. "You gave not just your safety, your comfort, your youth, but your very identity to protect others. That level of service is sacred, whether it's ever recognized or not." Sarah accepted his words with the same humility she had shown throughout the day, neither seeking praise nor deflecting the acknowledgement of what her service had required. She simply nodded, understanding that Father Martinez spoke from his own experience of caring for warriors who carried invisible wounds and celebrated invisible victories. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation of the day came when Emily finally had a chance to speak privately with her mother, as the reception wound down and families began to depart. They walked together toward Sarah's car, the weight of the day's revelations hanging between them like a bridge finally built across decades of careful distance. "Mom," Emily said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Sarah stopped walking, turning to face her daughter with the same calm attention she had given every challenge throughout the day. "Ask me anything. All those years growing up, when I asked about your work, your background, your past, were you lying to me?" Sarah considered the question carefully, understanding its importance not just for their relationship, but for Emily's ability to trust her own judgment as she entered a world where truth and deception often blurred together. "I never lied to you," she said finally. "I'm a software engineer. I do work for technology companies. I did grow up in Sacramento. Everything I told you about my life was true. It was just incomplete. There were parts of my history that I couldn't share because they were classified, because they belonged to a different person I used to be, because they weren't relevant to who I was as your mother." Emily nodded slowly, processing the careful distinction between deception and necessary silence. "But you knew. You always knew what I was choosing when I decided to pursue the SEALs." "I knew some of it," Sarah acknowledged. "I understood the physical demands, the mental challenges, the isolation that comes with specialized service. But your path is different from mine, Emily. You're serving openly, building a career that can be acknowledged, carrying responsibilities that can be shared. That's progress." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily asked the question that had been forming since Master Chief Rodriguez's first salute. "What do I do with this? How do I honor what you gave while building something new?" Sarah stopped beside her car, keys in hand, and looked at her daughter with the pride of someone who had just watched her greatest achievement receive public recognition. But her answer came from something deeper than maternal pride. It came from decades of understanding what service really meant and what it required from those who chose it. "You serve with the same integrity you saw modeled at home," she said simply. "You remember that the mission is always larger than personal recognition. You take care of your teammates the way family takes care of each other. You carry forward the values that made you strong enough to survive training, and you pass them on to the people who come after you." She paused, choosing her final words carefully. "And you remember that service isn't about what you get from it, recognition, advancement, glory. It's about what you give to something larger than yourself. That's true whether your name is on monuments or buried in classified files." Emily embraced her mother with the understanding that they were no longer just family. They were part of a continuum of service that connected their different generations and different forms of sacrifice. The hug lasted longer than usual, carrying the weight of truth finally shared and legacy finally acknowledged. As Sarah drove away from Naval Amphibious Base Coronado that afternoon, the same mist that had cloaked her arrival began to roll in from the ocean. But this time, the fog didn't hide anything. The truth about her service, her sacrifice, and her continued commitment to something larger than herself had been revealed in the most appropriate way possible, through the recognition of those who understood what such service meant. Behind her, Emily Chen began her new life as a Navy SEAL with a deeper understanding of the responsibility she carried, the legacy she represented, and the silent warriors whose sacrifices had made her achievements possible. The mother, who had come only to watch her daughter graduate, had given Emily something far more valuable than recognition. She had given her a living example of what service without glory looked like, and why it mattered most of all. The ceremony was over, but the real mission was just beginning. And in the quiet strength of their shared understanding, both mother and daughter were ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from and share about a quiet leader who inspired you through their service.